Thank you all for coming. This is a real honor to receive this award. And I very much wanted to thank, although I won't name individually, a bunch of people who were instrumental in making that happen. So I really appreciate that. The time that we're allotted is limited, and academics always love to talk about our own work. So I'm going to dive right in. Is this on already? OK, great. And I actually decided to branch out a little bit. It's going to be not technical. Hopefully, everyone's breathing a sigh of relief there. But branch out a little bit, sort of give some background that's going to lead to the topics that Amanda introduced. And I actually want to start off with something that is related in a way that I really wanted to link here. And that is the 2019 Nobel in Economics was awarded to 3 economists for looking at this or introducing this idea in economics of doing randomized controlled trials. So this is a well-known method in medicine in particular. And these economists said, hey, we should be bringing this in so we can see what works, and particularly what works best when we look at development interventions, for example, foreign aid projects. So the basic idea is the same as in medicine, is to have a treatment group that gets, in this case, clean water, and a control group that is supposed to be similar, other than the fact that they don't get clean water, right? So therefore, we can assess what's the impact on an outcome, for example, health of children, of having clean water or not. And we could, in principle, compare that to other possible interventions. So for example, we could have another randomized control trial where some people get bed nets to protect them from mosquitoes and therefore malaria, and other folks aren't given that. And we can, if we're collecting data on both groups, we can compare. And then we could start thinking about what's the best intervention to do, right? And this is important if we think about foreign aid, because taxpayers like us provide a substantial amount of funding. Preliminary figures from 2021 were, I think it was 161 billion in funding of foreign aid going from donor countries like the United States to poor countries around the world. So trying to make that funding more effective, to reduce poverty more dollar per dollar, is one of the central motivations of doing work like this, right? And that's why, one of the reasons why this was recognized with the Nobel Prize. That is critically important, but I'm not convinced that that's actually the single biggest thing when we look at the impact of foreign aid. Because it's not just a question of, do we know which intervention works best, but are we actually sending the funding to the countries that can and will make the best use of it, all right? So I'm going to argue here that knowing who gets aid and understanding who gets aid is as important as optimizing the types of activities that we're doing, that the focus of the randomized controlled trials. And in fact, it's well established that aid is not allocated just on the basis of need. So if you look just at who's the poorest country, which countries are best able to use the funding, that doesn't explain, for many donors, doesn't explain that well where their funding is going. Rather, geopolitics and commercial interests play an important role in the allocation of foreign aid. So you can figure out the best type of bed net to use, but if you're then sending your money to a country that doesn't have malaria and where the people are middle income and where the government is completely corrupt, and probably that's not going to have much of an impact, right, in terms of promoting development and helping reduce poverty. So along these lines, 2 economists had looked at this before and came up with an estimate of reallocating aid. So just thinking about doing the same things we're already doing, but reallocating it to countries that have more poor people and have relatively good governments that are likely to use this funding on projects to alleviate poverty. And they found that just reallocating should double the effect of aid in terms of doubling the number of people who are pulled out of poverty, right? So clearly, this is a big impact. And in fact, they only considered a simple reallocation. If you think about the problems that are created by donors giving funding based on geopolitics, One is it's likely to go to the wrong countries, right? But the other is that when a country receives the funding, the leaders of that country know why they received the funding. They received it because they're politically important at the moment. They're bordering Afghanistan, right? Pakistan, for example. They're a member of the UN Security Council at a critical time when an important vote comes up. They know that's why they got the funding. And therefore, when they look ahead to next year, they know that they'll get that funding again if they're still politically important, and probably they won't get it if they're not. But how they spent the funds that they got won't factor in to what happens next year, right? So their incentives, if they know that funds are being allocated based on geopolitics, the government's incentive to use the money well is greatly reduced, right? And that's not even calculated into this work. They just said, let's imagine everyone behaves as before, but just shuffle around who gets the money, all right? So it's likely even a bigger effect than this. So recognizing this problem that aid donors, the United States were particularly guilty of this, but there are other countries as well, that aid donors are heavily influenced by geopolitics and commercial interests when they're allocating their aid. The response often is to advocate redirecting these funds through international organizations, right? So instead of giving what's called bilateral aid, where the money would go directly from the donor country to the recipient country government, instead have a bunch of donors funnel their money to an international organization. The one that I focus on is the World Bank, and have that organization then provide funds to other countries. And the idea here is that the geopolitical impact of aid would be, the role of geopolitics would be sidestepped because the money is going through these organizations that involve lots of donor countries. Now, obviously, that depends on an assumption that geopolitics is only something for bilateral donors, for the individual donor countries. So that's really the starting point of my research, to look at this issue and say, well, what are the geopolitics when we're looking at multilateral aid? What is going on inside these international organizations? I'm going to give you just a quick primer on the World Bank, because probably not everybody is fully up on it. It's part of something called the Bretton Woods system that was set up at the end of World War II to try to better regulate how the international economy works. An important part of this was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, whose role is to try to stabilize the international financial system, right? So when there are banking crises and currency crises and whatnot, that's really the purview of the IMF. The World Bank's role is to promote development in poor countries, right? Which, as a development economist, then that's why I'm looking at that. And then as a third part of this that took a long time to actually materialize, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is supposed to be expanding international trade because of the economic benefits that go along with that. Almost all countries in the world are members of these organizations, right? So we're looking at close to global membership. I'm going to focus on just the World Bank. The World Bank does play an important role. It's the largest development agency in the world. Last year's budget was, or lending, I guess is what I should say, was $98 billion. So just, it's big. And it's also equally important because it's an agenda setter. It tends to set the plans for what's going to happen, what are the key issues to focus on, and so on. So plays an important role. The World Bank has two main funding mechanisms. One is something called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. People think of this as sort of a window of the World Bank. It is financed by selling bonds on international markets. And because the World Bank always gets repaid, it gets very good ratings, AAA, and it therefore can borrow at a low interest rate. It then adds a little bit to that interest rate and relends to poor countries that wouldn't have access to a good interest rate like that. So it's essentially self-financing, and in fact, in some sense, runs at a profit and funds the other work of the World Bank, in other words, paying salaries and various other things, and is close to costless for the donor countries, for the countries that would contribute. The other part of the World Bank, and functionally they're the same, it's just a question of where the fund's coming from and what terms are attached to them. The other part is called the International Development Association, and that is funded with typically triennial replenishments of money coming from the rich members of the World Bank, contributing billions of dollars. And it has to be funded that way because it lends at typically a 0% interest rate, and some of what it does is grants. And the loans might have a 40-year maturity period, right? So it's not going to be self-financing at all. It needs new influxes of money all the time. The IBRD is for middle-income countries that can afford the fairly good but not super cheap interest rate, whereas IDA is for the poorest countries that wouldn't be able to pay market rates. All right. For my purposes, the governance of the World Bank is particularly important. The World Bank has vote shares that are based on contribution. So unlike the UN, where it's one country, one vote, where Namibia would have the same vote as the United States in the General Assembly, instead, it's based on contribution. So the US currently has the largest single share, about 16% of the vote share because of contributions that we've made over time. And then other countries have smaller vote shares based on their contribution. We might be looking at China having a vote share around 6%. And Namibia, that I brought up before, would have some tiny, need quite a few decimals to get its vote share because it hasn't contributed very much, right? Instead, it would be receiving. Right. The board, so the countries have representatives on the board, and that's where the voting happens. The board votes to approve loans, and it also votes to approve new policies. Right? That's the degree to which it's involved in running the World Bank. So obviously, approving new loans is a big deal, right? That's an essential function for any bank. And setting policies is a big deal. But they're not involved in day-to-day operations. Their management and staff would be making those operational decisions. And those are going to include things like preparing projects, dispersing loans. So once a loan is approved, if it's an investment loan, funding, say, an irrigation project or something like that, it might disperse gradually over 6 years as different things need to be reimbursed, right? The pipe is bought, the cement is bought, et cetera. Disbursements will happen. So the decisions to disperse money are coming from the staff. And likewise, evaluating the outcomes, deciding if a project is successful, calculating a rate of return, all that kind of thing is done by staff. The World Bank gives two different types of loans. And the first type is probably the ones that we would be thinking of when we think about what are development projects, right? So that might be these are referred to as project loans where they fund a specific activity. As I said, it might be funding an irrigation project. It might be funding electrification. It might be funding changing the syllabus in schools. It might be funding a whole bunch of different things. But it is a set of funds that is targeted to a specific activity. There's a whole plan of sequence of events, a project plan for that activity of how they're going to take place, when they're going to take place, and so on. Right. So that's the first part, and this is typically about 2/3 of what World Bank lending is. The rest is what are called policy loans, which is to say it's money that just goes into the government's general budget. It hasn't been earmarked for anything. What comes along with it, though, are conditions. So typically, these are macroeconomic reform conditions. It might be about privatizing state-owned enterprises. It might be about lowering the government deficit. It might be about reducing the level of employment in the public sector. Things that are seen to be out of whack in the way the government is currently operating things, and that this move is intended to make the government and the economy function more efficiently. As you might guess, these moves are also painful and not politically popular for the domestic population, right, for the voters, if there are voters. And therefore, the funds are in some sense an inducement to get the government to go ahead and take the sort of painful medicine, right? So that's the idea with these policy loans. They come with conditions where once you've undertaken the difficult policy, then you get this sort of bonus of $100, $200, $300 million loan that's going to either be approved or dispersed and so on. So that's the sort of general background primer on how the World Bank operates, what it does. Regardless of what type of loan we're looking at, the World Bank typically follows this project cycle, and this is pulled off World Bank documents, right? So this is a sort of an integral part of what they do. Periodically, they'll do a sort of a strategy session for the country, what should be high priority over the next 5 years to give an idea of what might be in the investment pipeline. And then really at the project level, things begin here with identification. So that's where an idea bubbles up about what the next thing should be, right? And that might be related to infrastructure. It might be related to how some government agency functions. Lots of things. It may be coming from the government. It may be coming from the World Bank side. It may be brought in by somebody else. So there's an initial stage of identification where the basic sketch of the activity is worked out. And then there's another phase that's referred to as preparation, where the detailed planning work is going to happen, where a whole bunch of consultant engineers and so on are brought in to figure out how all this is going to work, what's the time frame, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and so on, right? So all that is happening through these first two stages that I'm, in general, just going to collapse. And then at this point, the project is approved by the World Bank's board and switches from the planning stage to the implementation stage, right? So I referred to, for example, in like an irrigation project, this might be 6 years of a period where things are being built, cement is being poured, different things are happening. It's being overseen by the World Bank and hopefully also by the government on the borrowing side. And it's moving forward until the project is ready, in the sense of the investment phase is done. Now it gets to start generating lots of benefits for people, right? So that happens at this stage. And then after that, they're calling it implementation completion, but this is including an evaluation that's done by the staff involved in overseeing this and supervising this at the World Bank, and then potentially an audit that the World Bank does to try to learn lessons from the activity, right? And then the cycle repeats, right? Then the next project comes up. The lessons learned are supposed to feedback and so on, right? So that's the general framework here. And I'm going to refer to this a couple of times in sort of fitting in where my research piece is in. I actually decided to back up a fair bit because when I was a grad student, I was actually looking at this stuff already, but without any clue that there were any geopolitics to look at. I just said, it's an interesting organization. It's the biggest aid agency. We got to figure out how to make it work better, right? And one of the things that I found is that nobody had looked at the impact of the supervision that the World Bank does to figure out what effect does it have, right? So that was what I decided to look at. It's looking at that and I can jump back for a second. It's looking at this implementation phase here, right, and asking what does World Bank supervision during that phase do? And then I'm estimating the impact of that on project outcomes and translating that essentially into dollar terms. Okay? So I'm going to rely on a few economists being in the room. What is one very basic thing that you learn in intro micro about marginal cost and marginal benefit? How are they related? Ryan?
I feel like you want them to be equal.
Equal, right? So if an organization is optimizing, we often think about this in terms of a profit maximizing firm, they're going to keep putting an input in, like hiring new workers, until the marginal cost of the extra worker is equal to the benefit that they get from the extra worker, right? Because if they stop beforehand, then the marginal benefit is a lot bigger than the marginal cost. And they could have increased their profits, right? Because there'd be a little return on this extra person you hired until the two are equal. So if we're looking at an organization that's optimizing, we should see, at least roughly, marginal cost equals marginal benefit, right? So this is one of my interests in estimating this, to look at this. And this is based on technical details that you don't need to understand about a restricted Markov process. But in any case, what I've got here is an estimated marginal benefit that's declining as we put in more and more supervision, which kind of makes sense. The dotted lines are the 95% confidence interval, right? Because anytime we're estimating something, there's some degree of uncertainty. So we can be 95% certain that it's in between those dotted lines, right? Here I'm looking at the return to an extra week of supervision, and that's actually, it turns out, over 3 years. So I should really be looking at this as 3 times. The estimated effect at the average amount of supervision the World Bank does, 12 weeks per project per year, is $750,000. The cost was $9,000, right? So that's not marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? And even if you take it down here at the low end of the 95% range, right, you're still seeing something that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, versus the $9,000 cost, right? So it's estimated, it's interesting. The advice is increased supervision, but it's hard to believe that an organization wouldn't have any idea that it was that far off, right? They might be not understand to the point that like marginal benefit was twice the size of marginal cost, but that it should be orders of magnitude bigger just doesn't make sense. And what this suggests is then that its goal isn't maximizing development impact, or in other words, if we're looking at a firm, it wouldn't be maximizing profit, but instead its goal is something else. Okay. So I'm going to try to speed up now, but that's the motivation here, right? Of looking at something and saying, well, that doesn't look so much like an organization that's ignoring geopolitics. Okay. So I looked at this in a different way together with Robert Fleck, who's now at Clemson University. We looked at World Bank independence in terms of the allocation of funding. And what we found is that major US trading partners got a disproportionately large share. So ceteris paribus, right, holding all the other factors equal, we found that if you trade a lot with the US, you get more from the World Bank. And likewise, if you're a major recipient of US aid, which we know tends to be about geopolitics and commercial interests, then again, you get more from the World Bank than we would have expected. So this is one way we see this influence of geopolitics here in terms of US preference. I did another study looking at conditionality. So I mentioned the two types of World Bank loans, some for investment, some that are supposed to promote policy change. I was looking at the policy change loans, and I was trying to address this issue that these unpopular reforms often just don't happen because the government doesn't really want to fire tens of thousands of people and incur the wrath from that, or eliminate subsidies on cooking fuel or something like this, right? But often the World Bank would disperse the money anyway. It would say, you have to do this. The date would arrive, the government hadn't done it, the World Bank would disperse the funds anyway, all right? So this seems like it would be a silly thing to do, right? It undermines your reputation. This is a repeated game where the World Bank is interacting with these countries over and over and over again, so its reputation should be very valuable. And yet, it's quite often just saying, here's the money anyway, right? So why does the World Bank not always enforce its conditions? Why does it sometimes not enforce them? I wanted to look at what's the country's relationship with the United States. Right? And so the way I did this is, fortunately, the State Department tells us which UN votes the US tried to influence people on, so which were the important ones, typically about a dozen a year, and which were the ones that we didn't really care much about, right? And so I looked at what countries made concessions to the United States. So this is the if you're at 1, you're always voting the same as the United States. If you're at 0, you're always voting the opposite of the United States. Imagine a country that is usually voting here, but then on the things that are important to the US, it votes here. It's not doing the US any favors, so it's not a friend, right? But if instead it had voted over here on the important votes, then it would have been making concessions to the US position, right? So I set up a 0-1 variable, a 0 if you're not a US friend, a 1 if you are, and broke country years up based on that. And what I found was that when we're looking at countries that have these policy loans that are, in theory, only going to disperse if they do macroeconomic reforms, if we're looking at countries that are US friends, there's no relationship between their macro performance and the amount of disbursement they get from these loans, right? But if we just look at the countries that aren't US friends, then we find that there's a significant correlation, that you get the money when you when you meet the conditions, all right? So quoting a former president from Peru, for my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law, right? So that's exactly what appears to be going on. If you're a friend with the US, you'll get your money regardless. I'm going to talk a little bit about another project that looked at an earlier phase. So this was more or less previously looking at these other phases, looking at an earlier phase here about how long does it take to prepare a World Bank project, right? So we want to look at, we started here, the project was approved here, a year and a half elapsed, or 3 years elapsed, or whatever. How long did the country have to wait to get its money, right? There's a problem here that there's no public data on the start date, right? There's a date for when the loans are approved, but there's no data on the start date. So what I used instead was the sequentially issued project ID. So just like in a law firm, if you work at the World Bank, you have to bill your hours to something. And that hours are the project ID. So a code is created, you can bill all your hours to that. That means as soon as any work starts on these projects, they need an ID. And starting in 1994, that was generated from a central computer and came out sequentially. So that gives me a rough idea of when they started work, because the lower the ID number, the sooner they started the work, right? So I was able to repurpose something called the stochastic frontier model, which is used widely in economics for looking at inefficiency in cost functions and production functions. And use that here instead, where we can simultaneously estimate the black line, which is essentially the apparent start date. And we can estimate the determinants of the distance from that line to the approval date. So that's going to be the number of months or number of days that passed between when they started and when the loan was approved. All right? And looking at that, I can then ask, OK, so what characteristics make a loan get approved quickly versus taking a long time? Right? And what I find here is that some of the most important factors were geopolitics. So alignment with the US on important votes. If you're one standard deviation more aligned with the US, that's a 25% increase in the speed. You get it 25% faster. If you're a major US trading partner, 22% faster. And if you happen to hold one of the temporary seats on the UN Security Council, so you're temporarily very important, then 18% faster. So all these things are compressing the amount of time that you have, or shrinking the amount of time you have to wait to get your money. All right? So again, a role for geopolitics. So one question we might have in looking at all this, we might say, well, the US has got a 16% vote share, right? So they're just voting on stuff, and that's what's making this happen. And I'm asking whether that's the case or whether the US also has informal influence. Because World Bank headquarters are 2 blocks from the White House. People are having lunch all the time. There's all sorts of stuff going on, right? So what else is going on? Well, we know that the voting is just on project approval. So that could have influenced the thing I just showed you, right? The US could signal we're ready to vote, and then it comes up quicker, right? But a number of the things I've talked about, enforcement of conditionality, that's a decision whether or not to disperse. That's made by World Bank staff. It's not brought to the board for a vote, right? Another paper looked at, instead of just the policy lending, all lending, and found that disbursement was faster for countries that were friendly with the United States. And then Erasmus Kirsting and I also looked at this in more detail in another paper that went and looked at global electioneering. And we asked whether there was a role of local politics in this as well. So in particular, we look at the speed at which a loan disperses as it relates to both local and global politics. We looked at countries, some of which had upcoming competitive executive elections, right? So within a year of a presidential election, roughly, right, or competitive election. And that had World Bank loans that were active. And what we found is if the incumbent government was aligned with the United States and the UN, so a friend of the US, then as the election approached, you see an acceleration of disbursement of these loans, right? So the money is being pushed out faster. And from that same baseline, estimated separately, if you look at countries where the government isn't aligned with the US, you see that the money slows down, right? So governments, incumbents that are aligned with the US are getting more money right before the election to presumably help their re-election. And governments that aren't aligned with the US are being starved of cash right before the election to try to, presumably to try to influence the election. Right? So again, this is about disbursement decisions, and it suggests informal US influence. All right, so I'm now actually going to get to what Amanda was referring to in the opening remarks. And I'm running short of time, but we'll make it. Thinking about domestic politics in the US as well. One of the things that you all have in your mind probably is correlation is not causation, right? You can show me all these things that are correlated, but there are lots of possible reasons. And you did all your fancy econometrics that was trying to tease all that out, but maybe you missed something, right? Can happen to the best of us. Another thing could be that it's not US influence, it's Germany and the UK and France and Japan, and the interests are just kind of aligned. And so we're making a muddle of it, and it looks like it's the US, but really it's a whole bunch of different countries, right? So maybe we've got the wrong actors here. Or the correlation is not causation, it's just by chance, right? So we're looking at something that's actually closely related to this. It turns out to be essentially the same, answer the same question, which is why would the US use the World Bank, right, to do these to use as a geopolitical tool, when the US has its own bilateral aid program, right? So on the order, if I'm remembering right, the last year was $34 billion, right? So the US has a big bilateral aid program. We certainly use it to reward and punish countries. Why bother with the World Bank, right? Our theory was that there are times when the Congress won't cooperate with the president. And broad brush speaking, these are times when the Congress is a different party than the president, right? Then they're not so interested in cooperating and getting things through about foreign aid. They have to go through Congress. Congress can prevent this from happening, all right? So we took a fairly simple approach. We replicated 4 previous studies, and we simply broke apart the samples that we were using, the years that we were using, into years where the US government was divided, president and Congress weren't all the same party, and years where they were all the same party. And then we just re-estimated everything. And we found that for all 4 studies, the results of those studies that had all found geopolitical influence were all driven by the years with divided US government. And that if you took just the years without, where the US government was all in the same party, you didn't find the effect. Okay? So it's really hard to tell it's just correlation story when that correlation happens to line up with what's going on with the US Congress and the president. And it's also really hard to say, oh, it was Japan or it was France, when the timing fits just with what's going on in US politics. Okay? So this is essentially saying that the message of those earlier papers is, on the face of it, looks correct, that it really is capturing US influence. I wanted to end, and I think I'm going to go a minute or 2 over, but I wanted to end with some more positive news, right? This sounds awfully, even the way out of this problem, it doesn't work, right? Something a little bit better. This is looking at the World Bank COVID-19 response is a project I did together with Carolyn McWhirter, who graduated, I think, in 2021, so an undergrad in econ. And we were looking at how the World Bank responded to the pandemic. It started doing this on April 2nd of 2020. It started issuing a bunch of loans that were specifically COVID loans, a lot of them going to health sector. But it continued doing its regular lending, and we can look back in the pipeline and see the preparation that had been going on for a couple of years beforehand, so we know those were regular loans. And then we can see things that suddenly arrived on the books right in like March, and we can see that those are COVID loans. Right? So looking at those, we find in this paper that the regular lending still reflects politics. So if you look at countries that are aligned with the United States, they were ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant, they were more likely to get one of these regular loans. So all that is still going on. But when we do that with COVID-19 loans, nothing, right? So you don't find that there's a preference on those loans for countries that are aligned with the US. I've updated this to look also at 2021. Initially, we were just looking at 2020, and it holds there too, right? So this COVID lending, for various reasons, seems to be insulated from the geopolitics that has otherwise affected what the World Bank does. So this is important. We know for COVID alone is important, but also this is an example of providing a global public good, right? Something that's going to benefit all countries. If we reduce coronavirus incidence in Africa, that means fewer variants, fewer problems in the United States, in Europe, wherever, right? There are other important issues that have exactly this characteristic, and the one that comes most to mind is climate change, right? So can the World Bank be successfully harnessed to fight climate change or to do mitigation activities, maybe, without the interference of geopolitics? Can't make any promises, but we have one positive example here where the World Bank did respond to a crisis without bringing in the politics. So that's all I have to say. Thanks a lot. I guess we have some Q&A or something else. Joyce?
Christopher, thanks for doing this. This is really fantastic, especially since I'm not an economics, in economics, it's really interesting. I really thought it was interesting how you looked at the divided government piece, because as you were talking, I was thinking that, but I'm also wondering, would it bear something, not just that, but by the influence of a particular president? If a president, let's just hypothetically say, was very strong about a nationalist view versus, like, would that alone, so even if it was united or divided, because there's probably presidents over time
Right.
in the US that have been more like that than other presidents, I'm just curious.
So that's a great question. There's a whole bunch of different things that go into trying to do research like this.
Yeah.
One is sample size, right? So when we divided it, if we split the sample in two based on, divided government, not divided government, that's pretty clean. When we start picking out individual administrations, it's not so clear that we'll have a large enough sample to compare against. There's a second problem there because when you start looking at this, you realize that the nationalistic presidents, some of them were like, we're going to play hardball with the World Bank, right, and get what we want, right? And others of them are like, forget about the World Bank, right? Who cares about them, and they don't do anything. We actually saw this in the Reagan administration. In the first Reagan administration, they basically ignored the World Bank. They didn't try to play hardball. They just basically said, who cares? It's multilateral. We're not interested in them. It's not America, right? And then suddenly the revelation came that, oh, wait a minute, there's this debt crisis in developing countries, and a lot of that money is owed to American banks. The World Bank could take over those loans, and then the American banks would be in good shape. And so the second Reagan administration suddenly is very big on the World Bank, even though it's nationalistic. So that's just an example of how it doesn't necessarily split the way that you might always think. So it's a great idea, but in this case, it would be a little bit hard to implement.
Yeah.
Klaus?
Just a quick question, Chris, about the 6 stages of the
Sure.
project. If you can go back to that, what's the time scale there? What can I think of as the time scale?
So the dividing line between these two is pretty murky because they don't even tell us when it starts, and I had to use a statistical technique to get at this. The full process depends a lot, but it's typically on the range of 1.5 years to 3 years. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why China has had a competitive advantage as it's become a big player in foreign aid, because for them it might be 90 days, right, versus say 3 years by the World Bank. That's a big selling point. This varies a lot. Again, the modal for investment projects that have a physical component would be about 6 years. This is typically about 1.5 years, I would say, and this evaluation is only done for 1/4 of projects. It's an audit done, and there it becomes a little hard to say, but the audit would typically be completed about 3 years after the project has finished. Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at whether geopolitics is influencing, that influence is increasing or decreasing over time?
Great question. I have not. I am sort of working toward it in a way. The data on UN voting, and this only became apparent to me after working with it for a while, aren't so great. The UN doesn't provide a data set. It's been put together by a number of different scholars, starting in Michigan in the 1960s, and then handed over to somebody else, and handed over to somebody else, and handed over to somebody else. So actually, together with 2 folks at University of Geneva, I'm working on an updated UN voting data set that's going to be more consistent in terms of what votes are included, and hopefully gets rid of all the errors. But at the moment, they're if it's the 1968 version, there's one type of error. So I can't be so sure. One thing that is clear is that there was a big drop at the end of the Cold War, and then a jump again with upward in terms of geopolitics with the start of the War on Terror. So there was sort of the 1990s period where it was a lot less political. But to be more precise than that, I don't think our data are really yet good enough.
Christopher, very interesting talk. I'm especially intrigued here as a non-economist. I'm especially intrigued with the policy side of things. And this relates a little bit, I think, to Joyce's question as well. And there's the president, certainly, that can help influence that. What other entities in the government would be having influence on that process. And then also, I'm assuming, but if you could elaborate a little bit on the COVID-19 success, was that mostly at the project level, or was there some inherent or resultant or concomitant policy part to that?
Okay, so it's a deep question. So on the first side, you're asking in the US government, who is it that would be involved with the World Bank? The lead agency would be Treasury. So there's an office in Treasury that directly relates to them or communicates with them. State Department is going to be very interested. USAID is going to be interested. EPA is very, very interested. And there's actually a monthly meeting that pulls together all, I think it's about 16 different agencies that come up with a strategy as to policy towards these multilateral development banks. The World Bank is the biggest, but there are also regional development banks, Inter-America Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and so on. So once a month they meet and they strategize. People bring in information from having lunch with so-and-so or whatever, and that's how that happens. Congress has a big impact too, but as you might imagine with Congress, it tends to be at the policy level and funding level rather than at the day-to-day, what project is moving forward, what one isn't. The second question was about COVID and what we learned there. So the takeaway here is pretty narrow. It's that not that the COVID response was wonderful, but rather that the geopolitics was not involved, right? When I do that estimation and I try to control for factors that are indicating why one country got a lot of World Bank COVID loans and another country got few, when I include things like number of COVID deaths, excess mortality, number of COVID cases, et cetera, they don't do a brilliant job of explaining what's going on. And part of that is a data problem, right? We know that reporting on COVID has been terrible. But I don't know that they've been doing a great job. All I know is that the geopolitics hasn't been inserted. In terms of policy, I don't know. Most of these loans have been focused on the health sector. So that they certainly have some policy component. I think John, yeah. Joe.
Chris, I find the stages of your argument very clear. I compliment you on that. I have a question about India. India seems to be an enormous moral problem. Extreme rightist Hindu autocratic government, enormous numbers of the poor, including the Muslims who are excluded, and the Dalit class. What happens with a country like India in both the US bilateral loans and the World Bank?
So that is a great question. The World Bank is supposed to be apolitical, right? So in principle, it would ignore what the government is doing. Otherwise, unless it can make an argument that then has an impact on health, poverty, et cetera, right? And then they could develop some angle along those lines. In terms of the US, typically it's geopolitical is the sort of top level. I'm going to sort of recast this a little bit differently. One thing I do with the students in my econometrics class, and I think I do this in another class too, to try to get them to understand the importance of a particular technique called panel data country fixed effects. We look at the allocation of foreign aid from the US to various countries, including a democracy variable, something that the higher the value, the more democratic the country is. And when you run that estimation, when you just run a regular regression looking at this control for a few other things, you find that democracy has no effect on US aid allocation, or sometimes even the wrong way, that the less democratic, the more the country gets. If you include this country fixed effects, which is now allowing for how things change over time within the country, then you find that democracy has a strong effect and in the right direction. More democratic, you get more. So the idea is that an Egypt is going to get a lot of aid, even though it ain't that great from the point of view of democracy. But if you see something like repression that happened after the Arab Spring, you'll see that it still got a lot of aid, but it dropped, right? So the US does modify the amount that it gives based on what's happening with respect to democracy. But the starting point has got nothing to do with democracy. So that same thing is going to play out in India. There's going to be some level that the US has decided on for a whole bunch of reasons that have to do with India's size and importance and so on. And then there are going to be incremental changes around that based on good or bad things that happen in India. But it takes sort of the higher power statistical techniques to actually even be able to pick that up.
I don't know if you had a time series of countries' friendliness with the United States, but are you able to observe changes in loan behavior in response to changes in their relationship with the US?
Yeah, so all the results that I've talked about are in the context of panel estimations with fixed effects.
Got it.
So these are looking at things that are changing over time, yes. Laura?
This is perhaps a little speculative, but could you talk about the role of China in increasing geopolitics in the world bank
Okay.
competition?
I'd be happy to. Erasmus and I are currently working on a project related to World Bank influence in China, and I've got a couple of other things going on as well that are looking at China. China has been an aid, even though we don't see it this way, has been an aid donor for a long time, probably starting in the 1950s, maybe even going back further, all right? They gave a lot of aid to Africa in terms of medical workers, railways built, and so on. Starting in the 2000s, that went up tremendously. And now it's tens of billions of dollars that are coming from China. And at the same time, China has been one of the World Bank's top recipients of loans. So it's kind of this weird setup. The World Bank doesn't really want to change it because, as I mentioned, the lending that it does where it floats bonds and then adds on some interest and then relends, that's what pays for its 11,000 staff and all these things, right? And China is a reliable borrower in that category. So that's a big part of their income. They don't want to lose it. The mystery is why China wants to keep borrowing. Because at least according to our calculations, their cost of borrowing at the World Bank are actually higher than if they just go onto a regular market. And they're not being given like deluxe treatment. They're not, in some ways they're being discriminated against. They actually have never, as far as we can tell, never gotten the amount of money that, given their size, they were actually sort of entitled to. But they've kind of gotten mixed treatment. So it's hard to explain there. There are people who look at potential competition between China and the World Bank or China and the US or whatever in this area of giving aid. And there is some evidence that there's a competitive effect. Some people find that a country that has good access to Chinese money will get fewer conditions on a loan that it gets from the World Bank. So I'm not sure I completely answered your question, but we can talk about it more later.
Okay.
Thank you.
There are no other questions. I would invite you to Toby for a great presentation and really interesting discussion. And I have one small token of gratitude for Dr. Kilby. Again, we mentioned that the award comes with an honorarium and a medallion, which will be presented at graduation. But it's a small little token, and thank you for everything you do to contribute to Villanova's scholarly community and what you have done and are going to continue to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you doing that.
So thanks to Dr. Olson for nominating me for this award. And I just wanted to say, Villanova's culture's been on the national stage a lot this week, like many other times. And I hope I today will show you how that culture also has its fingers into other agencies, federal agencies, government agencies, and the ways that our community here at Villanova is helping to shape things in other places. So today I'm going to talk about coastal ecosystems, and I'm going to talk about, in particular, sort of their fates in the face of rising seas, but also some of the ways that they're changing dynamically already because of climate change. And I'm also going to talk about sort of some of the solutions that I see as possible to deal with what we see as kind of a dire fates in some cases. And I'm doing that because I'll say working in these kinds of places is an amazing privilege. I feel very lucky to do so. It's incredibly beautiful. You encounter fascinating creatures like alligators and things like that. But you also, there's a sense of working in these natural ecosystems that there's sort of like a grieving that goes along with this, right? There's a lot of challenging things happening in these places. And some days you can just feel like you're kind of documenting decline, which I don't want to talk about today, because I don't think that although we are in some ways, I think that there's lots of other reasons for hope. So hopefully today I'll give you some perspective on some solutions that I think we can work with. So like most good science, this happens with lots of people. So in our projects right now, we have over 40 different people working from 12 different institutions. And really, this is the only way to do particularly big field science like this. And so really, the work I'm talking about today is the work of many other people, including, of course, lots of Villanova graduate students, some of who are here today, undergraduate students who are doing and coming up with a lot of ideas on these projects, our technician, Tess Adji, who really makes the lab run. I also want to thank the biology department. My colleagues in biology make every day fun and more intellectually engaging, and so I appreciate that. I also want to thank OGC, some of my colleagues who are here as well. The Grants and Contracts Office really makes things run and allows us to get the money in order to do this work. And I also want to thank my parents, who I'm lucky to have here today. They are featured over here. This is not the Oscars, I know, but I figured I would just, right, no slapping. No slapping. But I just wanted to say, I'm an advisee for our students here at Villanova, and I think it's really interesting when I'm advising these students in their careers and their path and their journey, and I always talk about their journey, and I have to say that my parents never had an agenda for me at all, which was awesome, right? I mean, they were really enabling me and encouraging me to do whatever I wanted to do, including mucking around in the mud, which is not the most glamorous thing all the time. And so I really hope for the students out there that you too get to kind of follow your own journey and your own passion, because it makes life really fun and you can change things. So thank you. And I also finally need to thank my partner in science and in life, Adam Langley, who's also a professor here, also makes doing this science much more intellectually engaging and fun. Okay, so I want to talk about wetlands, and I'm just going to introduce them briefly. I really appreciated Christopher's introduction to the World Bank. I learned a lot about it, and I'll do the same for you in terms of marshes and mangroves. So this is a picture of a mangrove. I think these are really amazing places that line our coasts around the world, right? There are these green barriers, and they're barriers because they have this robust above ground biomass in terms of mangroves, not so much in terms of marshes, which are more like little blades of grass. But they're amazing places because they live right at the intersection of land and sea, right? So they're essentially dealing with tides and salt water. And most organisms we know in biology cannot deal with salt water. And they're doing so in these really amazing ways that help protect us as well as help sustain our climate. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So this is where we find wetlands. You can see here in the kind of beigeous color, we see where marshes are lining the world's coasts, all the continents. And in the red colors here, you're seeing where mangroves do. And so marshes are found in the temperate zones of the world. Mangroves are found in the tropical zones. We tend to work kind of at the intersection of these two biomes. So these places where mangroves and marshes meet are called ecotones. They're really neat places. They're kind of two different types of life meeting together and making it a more diverse place. They're also really dynamic in this time of climate change. So as we are warming up the planet, organisms, because in many ways they're better at adapting than we are shuffling around and moving. And we'll talk about that today. But I just wanted to say we tend to work at these ecotones, like here in Northeast Florida where we work, and we've actually moved our study sites from here up to here because the mangroves are moving north with climate change, and we too have to move north with our studies. We also do some of this work in New Zealand where the same thing is happening, another ecotone, in China, another place, and there are other places around the world where these reshuffling of wetland ecosystems are occurring as well. So I want to talk about mangroves and marshes and why they're important and why you might care about them. So these ecosystems provide us with services. So there's a little bit of a debate about whether we should talk about natural ecosystems as providing us with services. But of course this is true. And people that live in less developed countries know this way better than we do, right? They're completely reliant on natural ecosystems for their food and for many of the things that they use. And this is certainly the case for wetlands, where you see here, these places are incredibly important nurseries for fish. So as you can imagine, in a mangrove, for example, there's all these kind of big sticks and roots sticking in the water, and baby fish like to hide in these places and grow up until they move out into the ocean, and this happens all over the world. And so this is an incredibly important place for fisheries. Mangroves and marshes are also really important in terms of climate control. They actually store 10 times more carbon than forests do on a per area basis. So even though their sort of footprint in terms of area is not nearly as big as the tropical rainforests or peatlands like up in Canada, they're enormously fast at storing carbon. And this is one of the reasons why they're kind of a big target right now for thinking about how do we solve some of our problems with climate change. So they mitigate our climate by doing this, right? They take up CO2 out of the atmosphere, which we know as we're emitting more and more CO2, increases warming in the atmosphere. And as they take it up, they sort of regulate our climate and have always done so. And I'll talk about how they do that. Mangroves in particular have been really threatened. Coastal ecosystems in general have been threatened because of coastal development. 1/3 of the Earth's population lives within a few miles of the coast, right? However, there's other things as well. So shrimp farms are incredibly important in mangrove deforestation, and we've lost about 50% of mangroves in the past 50 years. So that rate of deforestation is actually faster than tropical rainforests. This is also due to roads, which is incredibly important in the Amazon as well, which many of you know is an important thing to consider with climate change being kind of the lungs of the earth, as some people say, as well as ranching, which is incredibly important in the Amazon as well. So these are the reasons why we are losing a lot of these ecosystems. Mangroves and marshes are also really important in coastal protection. And while we in our research group are documenting this and other people are as well, I think this is perhaps best shown in this simple study that was done after the Asian tsunami, or what's often known as the Boxing Day tsunami that occurred in 2004, where 250,000 people died because of an earthquake which led to a tsunami and therefore killed lots and lots of people. And one of the studies that was done showed that in the areas where mangroves had been cleared, in kind of these pink areas here, the villages behind them, almost no one died. And in the areas where mangroves had not been cleared, the people all died from the tsunami. So this just shows you very directly that these coastal ecosystems are literally serving as a barrier for big storm events, as well as kind of more chronic sea level rise. So let's talk a little bit about how these wetlands came to be. My colleagues in biology, particularly those that work on evolution, think a lot about this. Like, where were organisms in history? How did lizards, for example, evolve over time? And one of the things they think about a lot are these kind of cycles of glaciation. And so this is what Florida looked like the last time the Earth was this warm. So two things happen when the Earth warms up to the oceans. The water thermally expands, right? So just like your fingers do when it gets hot, water expands as well, and that's one of the reasons why sea levels rise with increasing temperature. And the other thing that happens is that ice melts. And so the last time the Earth was this warm, this is how much of Florida we had. My parents wouldn't be where they are in Florida because it would be underwater. During the last glacial period, however, this is how big Florida was. And that's because a lot of a lot of water was bound up in ice. And so there was much more land. And so the Earth has gone through these cycles over time. Present day Florida looks like this. And it's really just about 6,000 years ago that the wetlands that we have on Earth today, the marshes and mangroves, started growing. And so I'm going to show you how that happened. So the way that, I'm peeking at the clock back here to make sure I'm doing okay. The way that wetlands build soil is like this. So after the last ice age, when the glaciers, again, this was land ice, right, were melting, there were no wetlands, right? There had been previously, but there weren't during that time because the oceans were rising so fast that the wetlands could not build. And then, as the sea level rise rate kind of flattened out, we essentially had this slower uptick in sea level rise, and that created a situation where wetlands could build. Here I'm showing you a marsh, but this could also be a mangrove. And essentially the way that happens is that these plants grow on the coasts, they build roots, they trap sediment with their biomass that's coming out of rivers or off of coasts, things like that. And that sediment and roots builds up over time. And it does so because this is waterlogged, right? They're soils, and so there's not a lot of decomposition of organic matter. And over time, this peat and sediment builds up and up to the point where you build land, right? This is literally land. And up until now, current day, these wetlands have done a really good job keeping up with sea level rise. In essence, they've been able to continue to build land as the sea level rise ticks up. the question becomes, and this is kind of the part where it gets sort of stressful to work in these places, is that now our sea level rise is really starting to increase. And so this is going to happen whether or not we do something about climate change. We definitely have control over how much of it's going to happen, but it's happening. And this is actually sort of built into the system of climate change at this point. And so we're really at the point with these ecosystems where we need to figure out what to do to save some of them and how to let some of them migrate inland because they're going to need to in order for them to exist at all. And so this is just more of I promise I'm going to get to solutions, but this is more of this information, right? So this was a great piece that came out a couple years ago in the New York Times Magazine that literally every hour an acre of Louisiana is sinking into the sea. Like we know this is happening, right? They're losing lots of land. Some of this is due to sea level rise, and some of it is due to human exacerbation of this effect. So we've channelized rivers. We don't let them deliver sediment to the deltas, like in Louisiana. We build roads that cut off wetlands from their flow, and therefore they sink into the sea. There's all kinds of ways that we do this. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of sea level rise in terms of it being chronic and in terms of it being episodic, because I think this is really important to understand our work. So this is just a trend line of the sea level rise trend that Adam made this graph for the sites that we work with. And you can see that this is only increasing by about 2.8 millimeters per year, really small, right? But what you need to know about that is that's like a bathtub, right? That water is increasing slowly, slowly, slowly. And this trend line is showing that this is going to pick up as we go through time. So that's chronic sea level rise. It leads to things like sunny day flooding that you might see at the Jersey Shore, things like that. But there's also episodic sea level rise, which is storm surges from big events like Katrina and Sandy and Hurricane Irma and other hurricanes in Florida that have caused a lot of devastation because all of that bathtub, right, is essentially pushed up along the coast, and that's episodic sea level rise. And both of those things have really big problematic effects, particularly during things like hurricanes. So this is what this can look like, this wetland collapse that can occur. So here's Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, which you can start to see here, this dying off. Within a few years, it looked like this, right? So these kind of strips along our coast are sinking into the sea because of this sea level rise that's been occurring. Locally, we need to be concerned about this as well. So you can now use this really amazing tool that's a partnership between Zillow, kind of the real estate tool, and Climate Central, which is an amazing organization of climate change. And you can look at any property and figure out its risk under different climate change scenarios by the year 2050, by the year 2100. You can look at the different pollution scenarios in terms of how many emissions we're having, and then you can figure out whether you include Antarctica or not, which is kind of a big unknown. And so what you see here is I go to Ocean City in the summer for a week every year, and you can see here that a lot of the properties in Ocean City are likely to be dealing with annual flooding by the year 2050. If we look at Philadelphia, we see, luckily here at Villanova, we're kind of out of the water, perched up a little bit on this hill, which is really nice. But I mean, this has lots of problematics for many neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And we actually just had a workshop last week where our center, CBEST, partnered with the V-Cruise Stormwater Center and Engineering to come together and start talking about how our two centers can kind of work together with these billions of dollars of infrastructure that are going to be built new to try to deal with some of this flooding that we're going to be seeing. So what do we do, right? So I'm going to use kind of the next 15, 20 minutes to talk about this. I'm going to give two examples from our research program where we are exploring these solutions. So one of them, interestingly, links to Dr. Kilby's research with economics. So one of the things that has been discussed is that we really need to put a value, a monetary value, on the services that ecosystems provide for us. And so we can do this. There's tools, things called Invest, which is developed by Natural Capital Project and Stanford University to sort of build tools to actually put these monetary values on based on the things that ecosystems do for us. And so we were able to first do this when an administration first started caring about climate change. In the Obama administration, they had issued this executive order to prepare the United States for impacts of climate change. And so essentially what they were saying was, the administration was saying, all of these federal agencies in the US own a lot of land, and a lot of it is on the coast. And we better start preparing for climate change because we know that it's coming. And so we were able to get a grant from NASA to actually work at the Kennedy Space Center, which, as you probably know, owns lots of land on the coast and has billions of dollars of infrastructure. And so what we were able to do is use field data this is my graduate student, former graduate student, who actually now works for NASA, which is fun, looking in the field at these marshes and mangroves and figuring out how they are actually attenuating wave heights. So what that means is when a wave comes on shore, essentially it comes on shore and it breaks, right? We know this if you've gone to the beach. As it breaks on shore, it kind of breaks and goes down. And you can see that here's the wave height attenuation, and as the wave breaks, it goes down. Essentially what this is showing, these green triangles are salt marshes at the Kennedy Space Center, and these orange triangles are mangroves, is that as a wave comes on shore, and we do this, of course, through field data collection, but also through a lot of modeling, it hits the shore and the wave breaks. But if you have a wetland there, the wave breaks much more rapidly than if you don't. And so, in essence, if you have 2 meters of mangrove, not very far at all, you essentially get 90% of decreased wave height within 2 meters of habitat. If you have 20 meters of marsh vegetation, you get the same thing. And so these wetlands are incredibly important in breaking up that storm energy. And you all could know this without me telling you this, right? If you have a bunch of plants and you throw a bunch of water at it, the biomass of the plants themselves are going to break it up, right? They're going to sort of diffuse all of that energy and water. And that's exactly what happens. And so what we were able to do was communicate through this to NASA through work like Cheryl, through publications, but also through our other great students here at Villanova, like Caitlin Dittmeyer, who is actually an English major who took my class and was like, I really am interested in doing science communication. So we worked with her to make this infographic for NASA, showing them kind of like a summary of our findings, right? Our currency is publications, but as scientists, particularly as we're funded by federal agencies, we increasingly have to communicate our results in different ways. And so Caitlin made this great infographic. We were able to do our ecosystem service modeling and find that about $5 million, mangroves provided $5 million more in coastal protection than any man-made barriers did. And so that's not even including the cost of those man-made barriers, right? So just by having these wetlands at the Kennedy Space Center, they were protecting infrastructure way more than if they were going to build seawalls. So they would do, the decision there would be, it's better to restore and kind of prop up your wetlands than it is to build a bunch of walls. That's not the case. That can't happen in every situation, like New York City, for example, but in many places it can, and that's what we're really moving forward into doing more of. So the second solution I want to tell you about is about working with these coastal wetlands to adapt to climate change. So when I did my postdoc at the Smithsonian, I started to go to these sites in Northeast Florida with my mentor, Candy Feller, and every time we would go in these marsh sites, we would see more and more mangroves. We were sort of like confused, like these plants we don't really work in these marshes as much as mangroves, but why are they here? And so what we started noticing is that mangroves are increasingly moving north or poleward. The same thing is happening in the southern hemisphere, but they're moving towards the pole. And the reason that they're able to do this is it's not freezing as much as it used to. So with climate change, we're not getting these extreme freeze events that used to keep mangroves down in the tropics, right? So now, increasingly, mangrove propagules, which are their little seeds, they float around really well on ocean currents. They float around and they will land on beaches, and then during high water events, which I just told you we have more and more of all the time, they'll wash up into the marshes right behind the beaches, and they'll start growing. And so there's a little mangrove seedling here, but over time, that mangrove will grow bigger, and it's a tree, not a grass, right? Again, something I don't need to tell you. And it'll overtop the marsh. And essentially what happens is you go from sort of a grassland like this to a forest of mangroves. And so this is really interesting. To me, it's like so compelling because this is like watching climate change happen, right? These organisms are shifting around on Earth's surface without us doing anything, right? And so as this is increasingly happening and mangroves are moving really fast, and I'll show you an animation in a second, there's all kinds of implications of this. One is that carbon storage is increased in situations where we have mangroves. So this carbon that I told you about that's helping to mitigate climate change is more and more of it's taken out of the atmosphere when you have big trees than when you have smaller grasses, right? So we were able to show this at the Kennedy Space Center, but then as I told you, we sort of had to move up. We were using historical data from satellites into Northeast Florida, like St. Augustine, to really catch kind of the edge of this migration of mangroves up there. And so this is an animation. So these are our sites now. I want you to focus up here. So you could see that this was mostly salt marsh. as you go forward in time, you see all these mangroves moved in. You also notice our little warming chambers that appeared there in that polygon. I'll just run it one more time so you can see it. But these are just Google Earth images over time, and you see these trees just totally taking over this habitat. And this is really, really fast, right? This is an incredibly quick for a biome shift to occur, but this is happening all over the world. Many, many places all over the world. New Zealand, Mexico, China, and many places this is occurring. And so this brought us to our project that I'm just going to finish talking the last few minutes about, which is the Wet Feet Project. So we have this really awkward acronym that I'm not going to read to you, but it makes sense because we are literally wading around in these wetlands and our feet are wet. And so we're using 3 sites in Northeast Florida, and this is funded by the National Science Foundation with collaborators at lots of different institutions, to actually kind of look even further into the future. We do this by actually building experiments to simulate the future, warm up the air temperature, but also using modeling, and I'll tell you about both of those. And we want to see, as I said, these wetlands are adapting to climate change. We want to see, do they continue to adapt? And can they help us adapt based on building elevation and things like that? And so these are some of our experimental infrastructure. This is like a drone image of our chambers here. You see our little platform, so we don't have to be in the water as much all the time. This is our experimental design. We have plots where we warm up mangroves and plots where we warm up marshes, and then we have control plots adjacent to them. We have platforms. We have all kinds of equipment that I'm not going to bore you with today, but it lets us essentially measure how things are growing there and how well things are keeping up with sea level rise. And that's kind of the gist of what I'll talk about today. And so I have to show all these pictures again because this was really challenging. You know, we got this grant. We really started to set things up in 2018. We got going in 2019, and then we were like, oh gosh, how are we going to do our work? And so it really took a lot of people to do this work under challenging conditions. And in some cases, my collaborators in Florida and their kids had to go out and collect our data for us because we couldn't get there. My dad had to come out in the field. My kids are not happy. They had to come out in the field. And so this is a lot of like physical labor. And I'm not telling you that to be like, oh, that's awesome. I'm just saying like it takes a lot of, like I cannot do this by myself. And so these are just pictures of our collaborators doing this field work really over the last 2 years. And I'm just going to illustrate a few key findings for you. So this first one is using those warming chambers, a few key questions were answered. One was that as it continues to warm up, these mangroves are going to do really well. They're tropical plants. Our climate is going to continue to warm. They're going to keep growing. They're going to continue to build more roots, which, as I told you, if you build more roots in the soil, that tends to lift up the surface elevation and help us keep up with sea level rise. So we found that, and we found that this is happening differently at different sites. Particularly at our northern site, this warming effect is even more pronounced, which kind of makes sense, right? Another study that was led by Tess Agee showed us what about when these little baby seedlings are planted into these wetlands, right? How do they grow? And the reason why this is so important is that around the world, after that Asian tsunami and after some of these other big storms, countries all over the world are planting mangroves. This is there's a lot of aid projects, I believe, that actually go into this. So we need to know how they grow best, right? There's been actually millions of dollars wasted in mangrove restoration projects at this point, places like the Philippines and others. And so we need to know how to do this best. And so Tessa's study showed us kind of like what kind of vegetation, marsh vegetation, do they like to grow in if we were to sort of take some proactive approach to actually putting mangroves in these ecosystems, which has all kinds of ethical considerations, but it's something I think we need to think about as we move into this future where these wetlands are in trouble. And we also were able to see from this study is like how much organic matter below ground, how is it being changed by mangroves adapting and moving into these ecosystems? Because that organic matter, as I told you, is what's keeping them above sea level. If that starts to break down and decompose, they will sink into the sea. And so that was another important finding from this project. This is my student Demir, who's in the back too. His project with Adam here, this was a great field day. Looking at how Demir's really interested in understanding how mangroves are going to fare with higher water levels. So as the seas continue to rise, how well do they do? What's kind of the range that they can live at? This helps both with understanding chronic sea level rise, but it also helps us understand how to advise people on these restoration projects as they're planting mangroves. What water range can you actually plant them at? And then we use models. So we need these models because we need to be able to look into the future. And we also need them because we need to be able to spatially extrapolate our findings, right? We're working at 3 sites in Northeast Florida, but we need to be able to say, like, for other places that don't have the same sorts of resources, there's mangroves all over the world in the developing world, what might happen in these places? So the first model we did was about time, and we take all of these field data, these climate data, these tidal data, these plant biomass data and things, and we sort of put them into a model to see what's going to happen as sea levels continue to rise. And so what we find is that mangroves do a really good job keeping up with sea level rise to a point. So this is a 100-centimeter sea level rise scenario. So this is fairly extreme. This is like a business as usual scenario with some pretty bad Antarctica dynamics going on, but it's not out of the range of possibility. Interestingly, we found something pretty similar with an 80-centimeter sea level rise scenario. And so what you see here is that if mangroves come in right now, which means by this pioneer mangroves, this y-axis here is vertical position. So literally, you can think about this as like the surface as the sea levels are rising on top of them. We see that they continue to accrete or build more elevation as the sea levels are rising, right? This is what I showed you in that first animation that wetlands are able to do. If, however, that sea level rise starts to get too high, in that case, mangroves, both pioneer mangroves that are starting now and mature mangroves, are going to collapse around the year 2060 and sink below the seas. The marshes are not going to do so well. They're not able to accrete at that same rate, and they are also going to be underwater. And so this gives us bounds on, like, what are the possibilities, right? How much time do we have? How much time do these wetlands have? And how do we let them change in the face of these rising seas? So one thing that's happening now is that I'm part of this marsh collective of people thinking about how to let marshes actually migrate inland, because if they can migrate inland, then we can still have them as our barriers. But as you can imagine, this has all kinds of implications for where do the people live, right? Things like that. So this kind of modeling is really important for that in terms of like time and thinking into the future. The other thing we're able to do with these models is to actually spatially extrapolate. So we work with our partner at the GTM NERR. So this is a National Estuarine Research Reserve. There's a series of 30-some of these all across the country. They're amazing places. They have boats, they have labs, they have other things, and we do research there, and we are able to work with their land managers to say, this is the science that we found. What can we do at your place here, where they manage thousands of acres of wetlands up in Northeast Florida? And so we make maps like this, a coastal vulnerability map, which is essentially putting lots of different kinds of data into a spatially explicit model and saying, these places that are in red are more vulnerable, these places in blue are less vulnerable, and this helps them plan, right? It plans for restoration projects, like we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers who want to spray a bunch of sediment on these marshes to try to keep them up, for planting projects, for conservation projects. And so we're able to like pick a site, like one of our sites here that we have the warming chambers, and blow it up and say, like, for each section of the coast, this is how vulnerable each place is. And so you can see the value of that kind of planning for figuring out, identifying sites that we can potentially have restoration projects or conservation projects to help these things keep up with sea level rise. And then we have workshops. So my job, I'm like a dorky scientist, right? Like I don't know anything about social science or land management or government agencies, but increasingly my job is to do this because we have to work fast, right? So essentially, we have these 2 workshops with stakeholders from all around Florida that work for mosquito control and the water management district and government agencies to say, like, okay, these are the issues that we see happening at this like little outside laboratory. What about the rest of Florida? What about these areas? What can we think about to do about things like this barrier here of oyster shells that wash up because of boat wakes are too high in the intercoastal waterway? Or what can we do about some of these places that seem to be going down behind that? What can we do in terms of restoration? And so we're doing a lot more of this kind of work now, and it's really rewarding and seeing science be put into practice like this. And so I just want to finish, hopefully I'm not running over too long, with a couple kind of like bigger picture things about solutions. In some ways, as I said, this is like a crazy, scary time, but it's also really hopeful in terms of like big things are happening really quickly in this field. One of them, ironically, happened because of the BP oil spill. So the settlement that BP had was $20 billion, and at least $5 billion of that is going to restoration in the wetlands in Louisiana alone, which is a massive amount of money to put into wetland restoration. And so that's occurring. Jamaica Bay in New York is doing all kinds of wetland restoration projects. There are now, as I said, part of this thing to make corridors for inland migration of wetlands. And this is just showing you that there's an enormous amount of wetlands here in the southeastern United States into which mangroves could potentially move if the climate continues to warm and we don't have as many freeze events. And so that kind of raises all kinds of interesting questions. I was just looking this up last night. There's 1,000 square kilometer mangrove restoration in Pakistan right now. So these are huge projects. And sometimes I think, like, could we really do these kinds of projects? Then you drive through the harbor tunnel like I did like 3 days ago, and I'm like, well, that was a pretty big project. And we did that, right? So who knows? So what's next for us? There's a lot of nutrient pollution problems. It's always our job to kind of be like thinking about the next problem if we get our hands around climate change with alternative energy and some of the natural solutions to climate change. We need to start worrying about nutrients. You may have heard about all the manatee die-offs in Florida that just happened this year because of nutrient pollution. And this is occurring due to fertilization of lawns, due to development, due to being coupled with sea level rise. As you see the nitrogen amounts going up at the same time as sea level. So we're trying to figure out, that's kind of our next big project that we just submitted a grant for last week. Thank you, Jenny. And then finally, there's this really interesting thing that's going on called blue carbon. So natural climate change solutions are said that we could do 25% of the solution come from nature, right? From conserving forests like the Amazon, from building more wetlands like mangroves and marshes. And there's this huge project that I'm going to a meeting next year in Colombia where they're going to feature this between Apple, Conservation International, and a lot of the governments in Colombia to preserve and restore these huge mangroves because they can take up so much carbon so quickly. So we really get kind of bang for the buck in terms of scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I think this blue carbon initiatives is something to watch for as companies are trying to get carbon credits if we move into a future where that is actually a valuable thing to have. And so what can we do here at Villanova? This is a project that my daughter did in our neighborhood last year of planting street trees. There's been all kinds of things in the media lately about like, should we really plant trees? Will it do anything? Of course, right? Of course it will. They take CO2 out of the atmosphere, they cool our cities, they take up literally particulates on their leaves and trap them away so our air is cleaner. So that is something we can do. Our Hugh Weldon we've been working with through our CBEST Center, and he's doing an amazing job on campus, and we're working on a new biodiversity initiative. I think we can encourage Villanova to divest from fossil fuels. There's no question that we need to get there quicker rather than later in terms of getting off of fossil fuels. We have a huge endowment. Seems to make sense to me. And finally, we can advocate for conservation in our regional areas and neighborhoods, et cetera. And so with that, I'll stop. I'll take any questions. Megan.
Hi. What is it about mangroves that makes them take up CO2 so rapidly? Is it the biomass that they trap, or is it something about their metabolism and their growth rate?
Yeah, so they have the advantage of being tropical plants, right? So they're really good at growing. I mean, we've measured growth rates of like 3 meters in a couple months, right? They grow really, really fast. But the majority of the carbon that they're trapping is actually below ground. We don't even see it, right? So they build all these roots and other things, and they just never go away. Unlike other forests, which when the plants die, the carbon goes too, that carbon's just trapped there for millennia. And so that's mainly the reason. Yep. John.
First of all, Sam, thank you for an interesting talk. I do want to start by saying that I think you're selling yourself short about just being a wonky scientist.
Wow.
Because you've been interested in the stakeholders for a long time.
True.
It's one of the real attractive things I think about your research program is that engagement of
Thank you.
various stakeholders. This maybe getting too wonky, but I just was.
Speaking of.
But I was interested in your thoughts about the role of ecosystem complexity in establishment of these mangroves. I think one of your studies, I might have been Tess's, deals with the different kinds of recruitment in different ecosystems, you know, the mudflats versus. I was just curious, that got me wondering about the importance of interspecies interactions in these ecosystems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know that from other studies that biodiversity definitely increases carbon storage and other ecosystem functions. Nutrients are retained better when you have more species. Carbon, there's more carbon taken up because plants in particular occupy different niches. They root at different depths. They occupy different sun-shade regimes. And so this is why sort of biodiversity starting to come on the horizon is such a big issue, because we can essentially capitalize on it to suck up more carbon and take up more nutrients and do things like that. And so it's certainly true in these ecotones with two different kinds of biomes, essentially. I think they're really resilient places. So one of the concerns that people always bring up to me is like, if you're advocating for planting mangroves further north, which I'm not necessarily, although I'm seriously thinking about it, what if they freeze, right? What if there's a deep freeze, a polar vortex comes, right, which is something that happens. I think what I would say is I would never advocate for a complete biome transformation in these ecotones, because the best case scenario is to have different kinds of species, because they provide you with insurance and resiliency to events like that. So that would be what I would say. Yeah. Chris.
Has this problem of mangroves been more exacerbated by like more intense episodic events or more constant chronic events, or like maybe a combination?
Do you mean like the actual subsiding of these wetlands? That's a great question. And I think the answer is probably different depending on what kind of setting you're in. Of course, in ecology, that's what we always say. But I'm going to say that anyway. So in Pacific Islands, like in some of these places where actually the residents of these islands are going to have to leave pretty soon, right? Because they have like peat-based mangrove islands. The sea level rise are just getting too great for them. These places are below sea level as it is. That's kind of chronic sea level rise in most of those places. But in places like Louisiana, the East Coast, places that have hurricanes, I really do think that is going to be our greatest problem. The Jersey Shore, I mean, it's just like you can only get hit so many times. And hurricanes are part of our natural cycles, but as we know, they're becoming increasingly stronger, right? There's more, we now know that, and that's just been in the past couple of years that climate change is causing that. So I think that these systems can rebound from hurricanes, and I've seen them do so, but if they get hit more and stronger, that's going to be the bigger problem. So both. Yeah, Christopher.
So I'm half a memory of this, so maybe completely wrong, but it seems that in some countries, and I'm thinking particularly Thailand, there's been sort of a conflict between maintaining mangroves and other forms of economic development.
Like shrimp.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there some way of finding some aquaculture or something that goes together with mangroves so that it's not conflict?
You know, I think that's a great question. So like years ago, I wrote a paper about mangrove seedlings and the best ways to grow them and things. And all of these shrimp farmers from Ecuador contacted me, which I was like, what? And I think that, so shrimp farming, particularly in Central America and parts of Asia, have been the major thing that have taken out mangroves. In other places, it's other things. But you're absolutely right. So I think that there are some really interesting ways that people are thinking about doing shrimp farming that would be different. And it would kind of remind me of something like what's happened with coffee, right, in the tropics, right? You can do shade-grown coffee now, and like a lot of our local coffee shops only buy from places that do coffee in a sustainable way. So I do think the way they did it traditionally is they cut down all the mangroves, put in your shrimp farm, and this, just so you know, a lot of farmed shrimp that you get is grown this way. It's in disgusting antibiotic feces-infested water. Then after about 5-10 years, that shrimp farm's done. They move down the coast, cut down the next mangrove, and you can see this. If you fly in a plane through Central America, like I have a bunch of times, you see this. So I think that that is possible, and I know that they are thinking about that. And there are aid projects going on with that. There's actually some shrimp farmers in the Midwest US that are growing them like in big warehouses and things, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, I think there are some ways to do that. You know, I think for now, wild-caught shrimp's like the way to go. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, Amanda.
So I appreciate and love that you're solution-based, because I feel like being someone else that's in a
Yeah.
different field, you often, I feel like there's when you talk to the layperson about this, they get just so overwhelmed with,
Mm-hmm.
is there really anything we can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not to be doomsday,
Right.
but I'm also aware of new data that's coming out of Antarctica of Thwaites Glacier, one of many, but Thwaites is one of the biggest ones, that is collapsing way faster than anticipated.
Right.
It could be bringing, initially, very quickly, 2 feet of sea level rise,
Mm-hmm.
and longer term, maybe up to 10. How fast can we grow these mangroves?
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and is there, like, because you said another answer that like 3 meters or something you saw, and
Yeah.
I mean, is this something that if the political will was behind it to say, we are going to put this as a possible solution and work on it tomorrow, are we on the time scale to make that happen, or are we kind of behind it?
It's a great question. I trust your instincts more on the Antarctica data, but I have been seeing the same things. So what I'll say is when the mangroves have been restored in some places, they can build elevation very quickly, like centimeters, right? Really quickly, which when we're thinking like of a bathtub model of sea level rise, which is not necessarily how it works, but if we do that, I mean, yeah, I think like with many things in climate change, we have like a decade, 2. Yeah, I think the time is now, right? Yes. Time is now. So yeah, but I would be interested, I mean, what do you think about that Antarctica data? Do you think it's...
Well, I think the 10 feet, which is the really super doomsday, I mean, that's a century or more out.
Okay.
Because that is saying Thwaites collapses, and then the West Antarctic ice sheet
comes off, right.
That's what causes the really sort of catastrophic.
Okay.
The Thwaites itself, which is not, I mean, it's not going to go tomorrow, but it's going faster than was anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the next 15, I'm just
Yeah, please.
15 years.
Okay.
I think we see a foot or 2.
Mm-hmm.
70 degrees in Antarctica.
And it is, we're 70 degrees hotter than we should be in Antarctica.
Yep.
And 50 degrees hotter in Arctic.
Yes.
Like
This week.
than we should be. So.
I do not think we have a ton of time. I mean, I think these wetlands have self-sustaining feedbacks, right? And some of them will probably be okay, right? I mean, but I hear you. I think it's like in the 5 years I've been working at these sites, one of our sites looks like it's going down. Yeah, and so and some of it's exacerbated by boat wakes. Like there are other things we can do that would help build resilience into them, that would help them get a little bit longer and maybe get us over that hump. But yeah, I think it's soon. Yeah. So that's exciting.
So everyone in the room needs to write letters.
Yeah.
Write op-eds, write letters.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say, I'll try to, no, I'm positive. I mean, I think, yeah, I know. I was going to be like, okay, the Amazon, yeah. No, I mean, natural-based solutions not just help us with climate change, they also help us with quality of life, with biodiversity, with conservation of cool organisms, right? So like, that's why I'm always pushing for this. Like, what if it doesn't work and if it doesn't suck up enough carbon? At least we get a bunch of cool ecosystems, right? That we get to enjoy. So I think more natural-based climate change solutions, as far as I'm concerned.
Hear, hear.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll also have this opportunity to give Sam another small token of our
Thank you.
appreciation, and thank you for everything you do and continue to do to support research in Villanova.
Thanks.
Contribute to our community. Thank you.
Thank you.